Okay.
My internet connection is unstable.
Yeah. Paula?
You sure my phone? My
No.
stubborn.
Wow.
Let us turn the sound on.
Share my screen. Share my screen. That's good.
Here's maybe they didn't begin yet.
Second.
He's not talking.
Okay. We're gonna start up in a second. Make sure you guys hear me okay. I just muted everybody, but you can unmute if you need. Okay, and the camera too. Okay, we're gonna start the share in a second. Shani's share in Beit Shemesh is running a little bit late. So Melissa's going to come on and tell me when they move on. I'm going to do a standalone topic until I get the okay from Melissa. So we're going to start now with a background topic. And then we're going to get to work as soon as I get the okay from Melissa. Okay, we're on. Just give me a thumbs up if I'll make sure everyone hears me okay. I don't see any screens either. You can use your camera if you need. Yeah, Paula, you hear me okay? We're good? Okay. Now, what we're going to do first, we're going to see when we're going to go back to the burning bush narrative in a minute. Here, let me share my screen real fast. And here we are. Okay. So, let me start the recording real fast. It should do recording. I think it's recording already. 1 second, recording. How do we do record? Okay, Melissa will be on in a second. Let's see how we can hit the record button. Stop the share for a second. And, here, recording. Oh, it's recording. Okay, we're good. Okay, and Melissa's online also. Okay. Oh, where's Melissa? Okay, she'll be on in a second. So what I wanted to do, let me share my screen again. Sorry, here we go. So today's share number 2. Last week I was in Chicago and I got up at like at 3 a.m. to teach you guys. I felt bad about that. Hopefully I was coherent. But in our introduction, our first class, we discussed God's revelation to Moshe at Har Sinai, at the burning bush, and not at Har Sinai, but then it was still just the burning bush. And our goal was to understand what was the purpose of the first Hit Galut, the first revelation to Moshe Rabbanu. And the question we discussed last week, which we introduced with the famous Rashbam, was what was Moshe's mission? What was he supposed to be doing? And we ended with the idea that it seems like God was telling him to lie. We're going to go back to that soon. But this week we'll continue our study. And to understand what Rashbam was talking about and how complicated God's mission to Moshe is, we're going to discuss this contradiction between what God tells Moshe to tell the Jewish people and what God tells Moshe to tell Pharaoh. Now, we're going to see in the background of everything happening at the burning bush is going to be God keeping his promise of Brit Ben Abtarim. So what I want to do for the first 5 minutes, because I'm going to assume you have this in the background, because since we read it yesterday, Parshat Shavua, I'm going to take just a minute and review the key elements of Brit Ben Abtarim, because they're in the background of chapter 3 and 4, and basically they're in the background of all Sefer Shemot. So a couple of things about Brit Ben Abtarim. Number 1, it's the very first conversation between God and Avram Avinu. It's very rare in Chumash that God and a human being have a conversation or a dialogue. We have one with Adam Arishon and Gan Eden and with Cain, but those are part of God sort of censoring them. They're very symbolic of rebelling against God and sin and consequences for sin. They have to do with the topic of the first 11 chapters of Bereshit in God's relationship with all humankind. But the very first time God has a conversation or a dialogue with Avraham Avinu is in chapter 15. He'll only have one other conversation with Avraham Avinu, and that's going to be with the story of stone. Those two conversations are core in understanding our relationship with God and the purpose of God choosing a Jewish people. In the first three chapters before chapter 15, in chapters 12, 13, and 14, God talks to Avraham Avinu and gives him instructions, and Avram follows those instructions, but there's no dialogue. The very first dialogue is here, and the opening line, God begins this dialogue after the events of the War of the Four Kings and Five Kings. The word of God was to Avram in a vision saying, and here God was opening line, was Al Tira Avram. The first thing God hears is don't worry, which means he has what to worry about. Anochi magen lach, I'm going to protect you, and your schar is very great. Your reward will be great. Three things. Don't worry, I'll protect you, and you'll have great schar. Now, this phrase, Anochi magen lach, is going to come up in our daily Shemot Esrei when we make the blessing of Magen Avraham. It's always referring to this promise. So we'll see why. Avram hears this. Obviously, he's going to respond when God says not to worry. But what's interesting is Avram responds to the last phrase, that his schar will be great. And Avram's response is, what good will any reward do if I have no children? So Avram asks God, what good is any reward you promised me if I don't have children? And who's going to take over for me? Eliezer. And God reassures him, don't worry, you'll have children. It might take some 20 years to have them, but you'll have children. Okay. I didn't say even from Sarah, but you will have a child. And your child, your own offspring, will inherit you. And he takes him outside to count the stars. And Avram believes God's promise. But again, that first conversation is relatively secondary because that wasn't what there was to be worrying about. Let me just check if I have a message from Melissa real fast. Okay, not yet. Okay, now, then starts the second conversation.
We're here.
Yeah, which would be the key one. Oh, Melissa, where are we? Melissa?
Yeah, hi, we're here. We're just trying to, for some reason, the speakers aren't working, so we don't hear you so well, but I'm working on it.
I'm just doing a quick review of Brit Ben Tarim, and when you're all ready, I'll get back to
the
burning bush. Okay. In the second conversation, God begins with saying, I'm the God who took you out of Ur Kasdim. I was behind your father's aliyah and bringing you here. And the goal of my taking you out of Mesopotamia was that you possess this land, become sovereign in the land of Israel. And Avram wants to know, we'll see how and when it's going to happen. Before God tells Avram how and when it's going to happen, he makes a covenantal ceremony by taking an animal, cutting it in parts. And then after we make this covenant or prepare the covenant, God tells Avram Avinu, and this would be in the background of everything in Sefer Shemot, God tells Avram, Yodo Teda. Remember, Avram asked, B'ma'ida. And God answers now. Okay, Yodo Teda. Surely you will know that what? Remember, B'ma'ida and Yodo Teda. That's God's answer to Avram's question. The children I promised you in the first conversation are going to be strangers in someone else's land. They're going to go through suffering and affliction, and this will take over a time period of some 400 years. I'm going to punish their oppressor, and you'll leave with great wealth, but it won't happen in your lifetime. It's going to only after your death, and 4 generations later. What 4 generations is talking about beyond the scope of our little introduction. And then on that day, God makes a brit with Avram Avinu that his offspring, which will later become the children of Israel, are going to inherit a land or conquer a land located between Egypt and Mesopotamia, the land of the 7, here's the 10 nations. Later, it whittles down to the 7 nations. Okay, so that's the background of God's promise to Avram Avinu. That's going to set the long-term stage of Jewish history where God's going to watch over our history. And again, it sets a framework. It doesn't predetermine what's going to happen. It just sets a framework what needs to be. So when Am Yisrael is suffering in Egypt under affliction, and before they come out of Egypt, they have in the background this family tradition, this family, I guess, history, that one day they're going to be redeemed by their God and conquer a land. But it's been in the back of their minds. In the meantime, they're suffering into slavery. And now when God's going to appear to Moshe Rabbeinu at the burning bush, this will be in the background. Okay, so that's our little background. And now we're going to start today's share. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
I'm just wondering about the conversation that Abraham has with God. Is it a normal conversation that he can hear God speaking like I would be speaking to a friend or something like that? Or is it something different?
So you're asking a bigger question, a more theological question about how Nebuah works. I'll give you my overall approach to questions like those. When we study Chumash, we're studying what's written, not what happened. Meaning, what happened is really interesting, and it's almost fascinating to try to understand what was Abram experiencing. Now, the Rambam, Maimonides, deals with that and says everything's happening in a prophetic dream. That's the opening line. It was a machazeh. So when you dream something, when you have a dream, were people talking? What was happening? In a dream, you remember like conversations, people talking, but it was all in a dream. So the Rambam uses the dream idea, the dream analogy, to explain how Nebuah takes place up until Moshe Rabbeinu, to our forefathers. What actually happened? Now, what's important when we, thousands of years later, studying Nebuah, what's important to us is what's written. The book that God gave us to study and read explains to us why we're chosen, not necessarily what happened. What actually happened is interesting, but it's not critical in deriving the message of the Torah, because God gave us a book for us to understand the purpose of our chosenness and the future and our, I guess, the goal of our history. So when I'm reading Brit Ben Abtarim, I'm looking to understand what's the goal of my history and what was the purpose of that suffering, and not what actually happened and what level Avram was and how God communicates with people.
Okay.
Now, so with that in mind, so let's get started now. What I want to do now, just for the fun of it.
We're in.
Oh, we're in. Okay, good. Okay. So that was perfect timing, the question. And now we're going to pick up from last week's share, where, again, we focused on the famous Rashbam, who argues with his grandfather, with Rashi, about how to understand what was God telling Moshe Rabbeinu at the burning bush. What was their conversation about? That's why it started with the very first conversation God has with the Jewish people is with their forefather, Avram Avinu. And that very first conversation is about the future Exodus and redemption, what we call this whole story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. And now the very first dialogue that God has now with Moshe Rabbeinu, remember there's only two dialogues between God and our forefathers, between God and Avram Avinu, Brit Ben Abtarim, and the story of stone. And now we have a dialogue between God and Moshe Rabbeinu, which of course is going to relate to that very same dialogue he had with Avram Avinu, with the very first one. And the question is going to be, what's the purpose of this dialogue? And it's going to begin the whole topic of Sefer Shemot, and again, the whole history of the Jewish people becoming a nation. Now, I want to take a break before we go into more detail about what God telling Moshe Rabbeinu. I want to go back and talk about movies real fast. I'm going to share with you the way I remember almost every movie about the Exodus. This should be really simple. It begins with a song we all know from growing up called Let My People Go. If you ask anybody, not Jewish or not Yeshiva Bachar, just almost anyone in the globe of Western culture, they've all heard of the story of the Exodus. It's famous. There's movies about it, and it's a famous story. When you tell that story, it usually begins with the Jewish people were oppressed slaves, migrant people in a foreign land. There was this evil king Pharaoh, and he enslaved the Jewish people. And God comes to Moshe Rabbeinu and says, go down to Egypt and redeem my people and bring them to the promised land. Let's go, let my people go. That phrase was coined by Martin Luther King about all freedom movements, the freedom of in America, of oppressed people in America, takes that same claim, let my people go, give us freedom, take us out of slavery. And what does God do? God punishes Pharaoh and the Egyptian people for enslaving us. He takes the slave people, makes them free, gives them freedom, and brings them to the promised land. That's a classic let my people go. So what happened? God tells Moshe, go to Pharaoh and tell him, let my people go. Pharaoh says, no, I will not let them go. And then God brings 10 plagues on the Egyptians. After 10 plagues, Pharaoh says, okay, get out of my country. Go wherever you want, just get out of here. We've had enough. And then a couple of days later, Pharaoh changes his mind and chases us, and then he gets washed up. And then the famous crossing of the Red Sea. Now, I'm pretty sure that's how almost everyone understands the story in Western culture. The problem is that's definitely not the story in the Bible, as we'll see. But I want you to tell me, take a minute, what in that story is wrong? Maybe you think that story is right. but just I want anyone who can tell me what in that story that I just explained about the Exodus of let my people go. Pharaoh says, no, I won't let them go.
It's missing-
I won't let
it's
them go
miss-
free. Yeah,
It's missing the Avduni.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's missing the Avduni.
Okay, because when Moshe goes to Pharaoh, we're going to see, and which is almost like mind-boggling, even though all the movies have it, Moshe never says, let my people go free. Moshe never goes to Pharaoh and asks for freedom from slavery. Never once. Instead, what does he ask? He asks for permission to go serve our God a 3-day distance into the desert. Now, we all know that we go to the desert and we go free, and we know that we want to go free. But for some reason, Moshe never tells Pharaoh the truth. Hope that's crystal clear. I'm assuming everyone knows that already from their earlier study. Moshe never says, let my people go free, despite the classic understanding. If you will check out Chumash later on, every single time he says, let my people go and serve me a 3-day distance in the desert, and basically bring me sacrifices. It's a request for religious freedom. Pharaoh says, no, I will not let them go. And then finally, after 10 plagues, Pharaoh lets them go. Now, we'll just take maybe a quick vote. After 10 plagues, don't you remember? Maybe I'll play with the chat again. Hope you guys, I try to have a little participation if possible. Just use the chat for a second. We'll take a little vote. From what you remember, after 10 plagues, when Pharaoh lets them free, after 10 plagues, does Pharaoh let them free to go serve their God, or does he send them out for freedom and doesn't want to see them again? Okay. Possibility number 1, A, is he lets them free forever. He says, get out of my country. I don't want to see you again. He gives them freedom. After 10 plague, for sure he's going to change his mind and chase them. But after 10 plague, does Pharaoh kick them out of his country, gives them freedom, say, get out of here, don't want to see you again? Or after 10 plagues, does he give them permission to go serve the God in the desert? B. Okay. So just for, if you have, and if in the Beit Shemesh class, I guess you can vote. I don't see you guys. If you can make your camera a little bit, I just see the lights. I see the light, but that's not my job today. If you can make your camera a little bit lower, I can see the Beit Shemesh crowd a little bit better. And now I can see you. Okay, that's good. Okay, so, but if people on chat, just say again, A means he gives them freedom, leave the country, don't want to see you again. And B is go serve your God in the desert. Okay. Just want to make sure and see what everyone's background is. So we got 2 B's and don't listen to other people's answers. Okay, A, B. Okay, we have more than. Okay, we'll give that 30 seconds for people to vote. And okay, based on your answers, I can tell what I have to focus on. Okay, we have 1, 2, B, A, B, A, B. Okay, it's 5 to 2 to 5. Okay. Freedom to serve God. Okay, that's another B. Already. Okay, so that's good. Okay, let me close the voting now. So it basically is around about 6, 7 people said it was only freedom to serve God. 2 or 3 people said that it was freedom for good. When I've asked this question to the average class, 90% of the people say it's freedom. Even if they're aware of the 3 days in the desert, they think that Pharaoh said, get out of my country, don't want to see you again, gives them freedom. But when you read Chumash, as we'll see, even after 10 plagues, Pharaoh only gives them, it says, go serve your God. In fact, take a quick look. I'll share my screen now and go to our source sheet. And we're going to get to this later, but we're just going to jump ahead. After the freedom, okay, remember Vahi b'chatzei halayla in Shemot chapter 12, okay? Pharaoh calls Moshe and Aaron, it says, Kumu tzumi b'toch ami, get out of my country, you and the children of Israel, U'lechu ibdu et Hashem kedaberchem. Go serve your God as you asked. You take your cattle with you and bless me. And we'll go to these psukim more in detail. But the answer for sure is B, the latter. Even after 10 plagues, Pharaoh only gives them freedom to serve their God. And then the big question is going to be, why does he go and chase them if they're only going to serve their God? And what causes him to change his mind? Okay, now, let's go now to the beginning of our source sheet now. Make a little more room there and put you guys up on the top. There we go. Now, here's what we're going to do. The goal today is to understand Rashbam's understanding that Moshe's job basically is to lie, and Rashban tries to explain why it's okay to lie. But basically, what we began to see last week is those confusing psukim where God gives Moshe Rabbeinu his mission: go to Pharaoh and take my people out. And Moshe says, "How do I do it?" And Pharaoh says, "Don't worry about it. I'll be with you." And tell Pharaoh, basically, we have to go serve our God on the mountain. Rashban claimed that was God's master plan to get the Jews out of Egypt. Basically, he was telling Moshe Rabbeinu, go tell Pharaoh to lie, and once you lie and he gives you permission to go serve your God in the desert, then just don't come back and you go to the promised land. And Rashban says that's the logic behind Moshe Rabbeinu's assignment. That was God's master plan, to lie to Pharaoh and hopefully he'll fall for it. And that's how it gets you out of Egypt. And then he brings up the question, how is it possible to lie? And God says it's okay to lie for things like this. I guess in war, always fair. And no, he lied, they tricked us, we're going to trick him. But the bigger questions comes up, if God's going to bring 10 plagues, why lie when you don't need to? To begin to appreciate that argument. So again, we're going to see on the one hand why Rashbam's analysis is right, but what's missing, what's wrong, or what appears to be wrong in his analysis. So what we're going to do now, we're going to go back to the burning bush, and I'm going to point out a contradiction. Where after God appears to Moshe Rabbeinu and tells him, here's your job, he's going to say one thing to Pharaoh, but he's going to say something else to the Jewish people. So I'm going to return to the source sheet in a minute. What I want to do first now is go back and open up a Tanakh. If you guys have your Chumashim at home, I want you to read with me inside. I'll share my screen and open up an English Hebrew Chumash. Here we go. English Hebrew Chumash should be right here. Okay. We're going to open up chapter 3 in Sefer Shemot and pick up where we left off. Remember? God told Moshe Rabbeinu in verse 10, Vatalacha, we're in chapter 3 in Sefer Shemot, Pasuk Yud, verse 10. God told Moshe, you go, I'm sending you to Pharaoh, take my people out of Egypt. Moshe tells God, who am I to go to Pharaoh, and how can I take them out? And God tells Moshe, don't worry, I'll be with you. And here's a sign, which we explained was a burning bush. And then he tells him how to take them out. When you take them out, go serve me on this mountain. Now, remember we said this was super cryptic, but Rashbam explains this is answering Moshe's second question. How can I take them out of Egypt? Can I take them out of Egypt? And God says the way to take them out of Egypt is by telling Pharaoh, serve me on this mountain 3 times. Even though it doesn't make that much sense, Rashbam says, read the story and you'll see it's true. So that's what we're going to do. Now, we're going to skip the next 3 psukim just to make life easy. Moshe asked God, I'm going to go to them. They're going to ask me, what's the name of this God? Pasuk Yud Gimel. And God says the famous line, yeah, sure, yeah, I'll be what I'll be. And there's a whole question, what's God's name? We're going to return to that later on. I want to pick up now from Pasuk Tet Zayin and listen carefully. This is Moshe Rabbeinu's mission, what he has to tell the Jewish people. God tells Moshe as follows, Lech v'asafta ziknei Yisrael. Go and gather the elders of Israel, who are supposedly going to tell the rest of the people. V'amarta alehem, Adonai Elohei avotechem nirah elai. Go tell the elders, Hashem, the God of your forefathers, appeared to me, the God of Avraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, saying, Pokot pakariti etchem atasui lechem b'Mitzrayim. I'm remembering what I promised you and what's happening in Egypt, obviously referring to the tradition they've had from their grandparents and great-grandparents, that one day they'll be redeemed. Those are the final lines of Sefer Bereshit. These were the final words of Yaakov Avinu to Yosef, and these were the final words of Yosef to his brethren and to their children at the very end of Sefer Bereshit. We're going to return to this in detail. He says, remember that promise. And therefore, V'amar, I'm going to take you out of your suffering from Egypt. That's a clear reference to V'abdu v'notam and Brit Ben Abtarim. I'm going to redeem you from your affliction. I'm going to take you out of Egypt as I promised your forefathers, and I'm going to take you out of your affliction and bring you to the promised land of the 10 nations. For those in the first 5 minutes, we saw all this in Brit Ben Abtarim. Remember, V'abdu v'notam, Inui, affliction, and 2, the land of the 7 nations. There was the 10 nations, but these nations were all mentioned in Brit Ben Abtarim. So basically, God tells Moshe Rabbeinu, you have a job to go and gather the elders of Israel to tell the people, be ready for redemption. God's finally going to keep his promise of redeeming you from your affliction in Egypt and bring you to the promised land as he promised your forefathers. And he says, V'shamodu kalecha, to listen to you. Then Ubata, after telling the elders of Israel, their God is coming to take you to the promised land. Listen carefully now. Ubata atav v'ziknei Yisrael melech Mitzrayim. You go with the elders to the king of Egypt, to Pharaoh. Ve'amartem elav, Hashem Elohei ha'ivrim nikra elenu. Go tell him, you together with the leaders, Hashem, the God of the Ivrim. We'll talk about why they're called, why Hashem's name is the God of the Ivrim, and what Ivrim means, probably the descendants of Ever. But now the Jewish people are called the Ivrim, because we have a God. And our God, of our family God, the God of the Ivrim, happened upon us. Now we need to go a 3-day distance into the desert to go serve our God. Remember, Moshe is not asking for 3 days, 72 hours. He says, we want to go a 3-day distance into the desert to go serve our God. A 3-day distance with a lot of people is going to take at least a week to get there and a week to get back. He's asking for I'd say probably like a 2-week vacation to go on a religious journey out to the desert to serve their God. That's what he's asking for. Now, what's the problem? The problem is God tells one thing to the Jewish people. Go tell the people you're going to the promised land. And then he says, go to Pharaoh and tell them a different story. You simply want to go to serve your God. Now, it's exactly this contradiction that the Rashbam was making his big deal about. Because how could, on the one hand, God tell the Jewish people, we're going to the promised land, tell them the truth, and go make up a story to Pharaoh like we have to go serve our God? So he says, what's he saying? He's saying, this is exactly God's master plan. God's telling Moshe Rabbeinu, go lie to Pharaoh. Make up a story about religious freedom with the hope that he'll say yes, and then you'll go free. But don't tell them the truth. And then Rashbam asks the question, how can he lie? He says, God's allowed to use a lie to get us out of Egypt. But again, there's 2 questions there I have. Question number 1, why lie when you don't need to lie? Once God's going to bring 10 plagues, why bother? Just tell the truth. What's wrong with the truth? If Pharaoh have to give it anyhow. And number 2, which I think is a bigger question, about the lying, we'll see a famous Ebenezer in a minute. But at a more practical level, if we're looking at this realistically, how do you tell the entire Jewish people, at least the elders, but the assumption is that everyone's going to hear about this, and we'll prove it later on, that everyone's going to hear this message of redemption. How do you tell the entire Jewish people, God's taking you to the promised land, you're going free, and think that Pharaoh's not going to find out? And that question is going to be the key to our discussion. Even if Rashbam is right, that this is God's plan, it's not realistic in the sense that how is Pharaoh not going to find out? Why lie and think that no one's going to tell Pharaoh? That's question number 1 on that. Question number 2, God's going to say, I know God's going to say no. And we'll see, that's really confusing what that phrase means, without his strong hand. And then I'm going to send all my plagues on Egypt. And then he'll send you out. Because I want to first bring plagues, and then he'll send you out. Again, if God's going to bring plagues, then why bother to lie if no matter what, after 10 plagues and the firstborn, Pharaoh will say yes to anything? So again, why lie when you don't need to? And how can we assume that everyone's going to keep a secret? Now, let me share with you a little, let me take a look and, okay, exactly. So Diana's question was, why does Hashem need to do it that way? It's why, just take them out. That's going to be our biggest question. Now, let me stop the share here. I'm going to share with you a Ibn Ezra, which is at the 9th plague, before Choshech, where he asks exactly this question. Go back to the source sheet I gave you. And it's at the very, very end. It's on the last page. It's the famous Ibn Ezra. Again, we're not doing the Ibn Ezra on here. It's in chapter 11, the beginning of chapter 11. He says as follows, the Ibn Ezra. V'da. On your source sheet, I think it's page 5, the very last page. Okay, V'da, and no. Ki davar gadol haya. This was a great thing. What? V'tzadikim gemurim ho Yisrael. The Jewish people were tzadikim gemurim. It's very rare. Am Yisrael gets such a good report card. Ibn Ezra gives them one. Why? You were great, righteous people. Why? Shelo gilu hasod. What's Ibn Ezra claiming? That no one told the secret. 600,000, more than that, over 600,000 men over age of 20, but that's 2 million people. They all know they're going and leaving Egypt for good, and no one squealed. No one told their Egyptian masters or anything. No one told the truth, and all the Egyptians thought we're only going to serve our God, and we all know we're leaving. Okay, what was the secret? V'hu sheparo chashav al divrei Moshe derech shlosh yamim she'elchu v'yashuvu el Mitzrayim. What did Pharaoh think? Pharaoh thought, like Moshe said, that we're going a 3-day distance into the desert and they're going to come back to Egypt, v'yashuvu el Mitzrayim. Got it? But everyone knew the truth that we're really not coming back. But you understand from Ibn Ezra's question? Ibn Ezra's question is assuming that all the Jews know they're going to the promised land and all the Egyptians don't know that we're going to the promised land. And everyone kept the secret. And his only answer is they were all tzaddikim, no one told the secret, which I think would be bigger than any of the miracles. Now, and then he says, don't worry, the Navi didn't lie. Why? We will come nowadays with our children a white lie. Because, it's really not a lie, Ibn Ezra says. Why? Because Moshe never said we're coming back. He just says, we're going 3 days in the desert to serve our God. We didn't say we're coming back. So, because Pharaoh understood we're coming back, but don't worry, Moshe really never lied. He didn't say we're coming back. Then he adds, God's wisdom is above ours. Basically, we can't understand things like this about God lying, but we have to accept it. Then he bothered by the question, why lie when you don't need to? The reason why there was a need to lie like this, and it's a cover-up story, 2 reasons. One is, if one reason is financial. What was the financial reason? If the Egyptian people thought we're not coming back, they wouldn't have lent us all that gold and silver and all their vessels and all the clothing that we needed to serve our God. What put them in the frame of mind they were so willing to lend us whatever we needed? Because they were sure we were coming back. Therefore, they lent us. Because they understand by Shalom means to lend. And therefore, to make sure that to make sure that God will fulfill his promise that they'll leave with the Rechush Gadol, with great wealth, as he promised in Brit Ben of Tarim, we needed this lie to make sure the Egyptians lend us as much as we can. But Davar Sheni, Shidba Paro B'chelo. We want to trick Pharaoh to change his mind, because once he assumes we're coming back, once Pharaoh assumes that we are coming back and we don't come back, that's going to call Pharaoh to chase us. Once Pharaoh chases us, then God will have a chance to drown him in the Dead Sea. Had we left with permission for good, then he wouldn't have chased us. Maybe if Pharaoh knew we weren't coming back, we wouldn't have Kriyat Yam Suf. Okay? And he'll bring a proof again, the people ran away, which means that he didn't know we were leaving. Okay. So we have to deal with both of these points of the Ibn Ezra later on as well. I'm just bringing the Ibn Ezra to prove to you that Ibn Ezra, who knows his Chumash, was bothered number one by the lie. And again, he assumes that it is a lie, but there's a reason for the lie, financial and also military. But number 2, he was saying that all the Jews know we're leaving for good, and Pharaoh has no idea that we're not coming back. Now, what I want to do in the shir today is, first I explain to you that it's clear both Ibn Ezra and Rashbam agree that this is God's plan. God's plan is to trick Pharaoh to think we're only going to serve our God in the desert, and then you have to come up with this amazing idea that no one's going to tell the secret, and they won't find out about it, and I guess we'll get away with it. And then the big question comes up: why the need to lie? Now, I want to in my shir today, I want to give a totally different explanation of why the need to lie and why it's not a lie on the one hand, but why it's necessary to do it this way. First thing I want to do is just support the first part, everything Rashbam's saying, as follows. Let's go back to our source sheet. I'll just go over a couple things. Number 1. So again, let's review the contradiction in chapter 3. In chapter 3, as Rashbam pointed out, First, God tells Moshe, tell the people, go gather the elders of Israel and tell them, I'm taking you from your affliction in Egypt to the land, to the promised land. And then in the next pasuk, it says, go to Pharaoh and tell him we need to go a 3-day distance in the desert. And I know he's going to say no, but I'm going to go anyhow. Okay. Then, when Moshe actually goes to Pharaoh, what does he say? In chapter 5, Moshe goes to Pharaoh and tells him, send my people out and serve me. Send me to go to the desert to serve God. Pharaoh says, I never heard of this God. And then Moshe repeats, V'amru Elohei Ivrim nikra aleinu, right? The God of the Ivrim called upon us. Let's go a 3-day distance in the desert. And if we don't serve our God, what will happen? What's Moshe tell Pharaoh? If we don't serve our God needs to be worshipped. And this now, in chapter 5, we get a much better understanding of the strategy. He says, if we don't serve our God in the desert, it's in Egypt's interest that we serve our God, because if we don't serve our God, he's going to get really angry and bring plagues on all of us. Who's all of us? Either all of us, everybody, or at least the Egyptians. Maybe not us, as we'll see when the plagues can happen. Now, that's the first warning where Pharaoh says no, because he never heard of this God. What happens little by little before every single plague? What does Moshe say every time? He says, Shlach tami v'yavduni. Again, we can go through everyone later on. We'll see. Before every plague, Moshe says, send my people out and serve me. He never says, let my people go free, but rather, send my people to serve me. And there's a warning before every plague, or almost every plague. And when Pharaoh doesn't send them out, God brings a plague. What's that proof to Pharaoh? That if we don't serve our God, the plagues are going to get consistently worse. And Pharaoh sometimes gives in. He says, go serve your God in the land, not in the desert. Then he says, then he tells the people, let the men go without the women. And they says, let the women go, let the kids go, but don't take your cattle and things like that. We'll go through all the negotiations later on. But it's clear when you follow the story, especially at the very end, where Pharaoh finally lets them go after the 10th plague. He says, go serve your God, like you said. Right? Go serve your God, like you said, a 3-day distance in the desert to serve me. Now, here's what I want to explain. And hope I don't get in trouble for this. I want to claim something totally different. That's like we have to change our frame of mind. What I want to claim is this master plan of God to tell Pharaoh this 3-day distance in the desert is super practical because you can't tell the truth. What's my point? Had Moshe told Pharaoh the truth, that the Jews would leave Egypt for good, no one would believe the truth. I'll try to explain why. Look at the reality. For the last 200 years, at least, the Jews have been part of Egypt. They're 4th-class citizens in Egypt. They're migrant people that were enslaved. I don't want to give analogies, but basically, we're migrant people enslaved in Egypt, but we're part of Egypt. You can't get rid of them. The Jews are part of Egypt. They're the workforce. They're enslaved. Egypt takes advantage of them, but Egypt's economy is based on them. And the eyes of the Egyptians, the Jews are going nowhere. Got that? In the eyes of the Egyptians, the Jews, even if they said they were going to Israel, no one would believe them. I'll give you a really bad analogy, which you guys, since you all made Aliyah, you'll appreciate. If all the Jews in Teaneck said 3 times a day, we're all planning to go to Israel, right? If we only could, we'd all go to Israel. As soon as God would bring us there, right? We're all planning to leave Teaneck and move to Israel. No one in Bergen County, no one in New Jersey would believe them. What do you mean? You're part of the American community. You could say it 3 times a day and no one would believe you. The point is, the Jews are part of Egypt. There's nowhere for them to go. Now, even if they said they were going away, no one would believe them, because where could they go to? What are the Jews' options? Again, before all the plagues begin. Even if Pharaoh gave them permission to leave for good, where could they go to? They can't go into the desert and survive there. They can't go to I'll go 4 directions. If they go to the south, they're still in Egypt. They haven't left Egypt. If they go to southern Egypt, they're still to northern. Now they're northern Egypt. If they go southern Egypt, they're still part of Egypt, or later Ethiopia, but they've gone nowhere. Now, number 2, if they go to the west, that's the Sahara Desert. They can't survive there. They go to the east, that's the Sinai Desert. They can't survive there. They go to the north, that's the sea. They can't survive there either. There's nowhere for them to go. Can they go to Canaan? There's no way they could go to Canaan. Why? Because in Canaan, they'd be wiped out. But I'll prove to you in a minute, even after all the plagues, and in fact, after a whole year of all the miracles, when we send spies to conquer Canaan, what did 10 out of the 12 leaders say? That it's impossible to conquer Canaan, even with God's help. I mean, the whole idea that 1 million, 2 million Jews could leave Egypt and take over Canaan was impossible. So I'm just painting a picture that in the eyes of the Egyptians, there's absolutely nowhere for the Jews to go. The Jews are part of Egypt, and they're going nowhere. There's only one fear the Egyptians have, and here's my key point I want to get across. And this, I need this background to understand our study of Sefer Shemot, the first 12, 14 chapters. My assumption is as follows. In the eyes of the Egyptians, there's nowhere for the Jews to go. Therefore, Egypt has one fear and only one fear, and that's a takeover, a military takeover, and we'll see it in the verses in the beginning of the book. Meaning, if you know your Egypt history, Egyptology, there's almost 30 different dynasties. Every 50, 100, 200 years or so, every X amount of time, sometimes it's 20 years, sometimes it's 100 years, but every several decades, there's a takeover in Egypt. There's a new dynasty. Why? Egypt is a superpower. They have tremendous resources, and they're powerful and with great wealth. Everyone knows that from the pyramids. There's always someone who wants to control Egypt, because if you control Egypt, you control its wealth and its resources. Who runs Egypt? There's always a dynasty. And no matter who the dynasty is, every pharaoh worth his name is always worried about a takeover. The takeover can be within his family. The takeover can be another group of people, another ethnic group within Egypt. The takeover could be a foreign power, like the Hyksos, as you know from outside history, or the Plishtim later on, or later the Romans, or whoever it could be. Egypt is always worried about a takeover. Got it? And it makes sense. That's happened through its history. That's why there's so many different dynasties. And therefore, the Jews are part of Egypt. The only fear the Egyptians have are that the Jews are going to take over their country. These slave people are going to take over their country. What prevents them from doing that? Their enslavement. You make them fourth-class citizens. You give them no rights. You give them hard work. They can't control wealth. You enslave them, and as a slave population, you control them, and that takes away any possibility of them, joining up and rebelling. You want to stop any possible rebellion, and that's part of the reason for their enslavement, as we're reading exactly in the Psukim. What's Pharaoh's biggest fear? If he hears the Jews saying, "We want to leave Egypt and go serve our God," he's going to think that's a cover-up for something else. They're going to leave Egypt, go to the desert. In the desert, what are they going to do? They're going to reorganize, maybe join up with another foreign power, and then come back and take over Egypt. That's my claim. Meaning, Pharaoh's fear is never about the Jews leaving. If Moshe went to Pharaoh and told him, "We're going to the promised land," he'd be laughed out of Pharaoh's court, or Pharaoh's presence. He goes, "What do you mean? That's suicidal." No one in Egypt would believe the truth. If you go tell the truth, "We're going to the promised land," no one in Egypt would believe you. It's not a question of lying. You can't tell the truth because the truth is not realistic, as we'll see. There's only one thing the Egyptians are afraid of, and that's a takeover. And therefore, when Moshe goes to Pharaoh and says, "We want to serve our God in the desert, we want to take all the people with us," he's afraid that the Jews are going to go, and first they won't go to the desert. Instead, they're going to pretend they're going to the desert, come back around, and either go south and set up their own country, either they'll declare independence somewhere else in Egypt, or join a foreign enemy and try to take over Egypt. And that's his biggest fear. And we're going to take that idea and follow the whole story. And that's going to explain to us why the need to lie. Number two, that's point number one. So I'm solving Rashbam's question about why the need to lie. The need to lie is because, number one, you can't tell the truth. And we'll see in a minute, as Ebenezer pointed out, it's really not a lie, because that's what we end up doing. We go a 3-day distance in the desert, we serve our God. If you know your Jewish history, that generation never makes it to Israel, do we? It's going to be another 40 years till we get to Israel, and we do go to the desert and serve our God. So we end up actually telling the truth. We go to the desert, but there's a bigger point going on, and this is the one which is even more difficult, but I think also very realistic. Besides convincing Pharaoh to let us out of his country, again, it's not a question of getting Pharaoh to give us permission to leave. There's a much bigger issue. And that's going to be, unfortunately, almost most of Jewish history. How are we going to get the Jews to leave Egypt? Now think of that for a minute. We have almost 2 million Jews living in Egypt. Say at least 1 million. Remember, 600,000 men above the age of 20. We have tens, hundreds of thousands of Jews in Egypt. How are we going to get all of them to leave Egypt all at once at the same time with great wealth? Treat it like a Mission Impossible kind of idea. Meaning, I need a plan to get the entire Jewish people out of Egypt with great wealth overnight and get them all to leave. If you know any Jewish history, how do you get the Jews to leave any country? It's people don't pick up and leave their homes so easily, even if they're under oppression. When they're not under oppression, it's almost impossible. But how are you going to get an entire population to pick up and leave Egypt? My claim is, if Pharaoh gave them permission to leave, maybe a couple of B'nai Kivniks would have actually left. Most people would not have left because, even though they're slaves, they're comfortable in their they're sort of comfortable with their slavery. If you know American history also, once you give slaves freedom, they don't know what to do with it, number one. Number two, they don't know where they're going because it's very fearful to pick up and leave. Where are you going to? You've heard about this promised land, but again, you know there's Canaanites there. And number two, you've never been anywhere else for over 100, 200 years at least. The people have been living in Egypt. They don't know any other existence. Now, I'm going to bring you one more proof of what the people were thinking. After 10 plagues, right? After we go Egypt, when Pharaoh chases them afterwards, later we'll see why Pharaoh's going to chase them. Listen to what the people say right before the splitting of the sea. Right before God splits the sea. Remember, the Pharaoh chases them. Listen what the people say. Okay, and we're in chapter 14. Okay, Pharaoh came close. Bnei Yisrael lifted up their eyes. By Tzaiku Bnei Yisrael Hashem, they cry out to God. What do they say? Moshe. The people start complaining to Moshe Rabbeinu, what'd you do to us? Look at this mess you put us into. Why'd you take us out of Egypt? Just to kill us? They think that Moshe is in cahoots with Pharaoh to get rid of them. Okay? And then he says as follows. We told you, Moshe, back in Egypt, when you talked to us about freedom and about going free and all that, leave us alone. And chadal, that's a modern, we use that in Hebrew a lot now. Chadal means stop, enough. Leave us alone. Okay? Then let us continue our slavery in Egypt. Why? If the option of freedom means going to the desert and our other option is remaining slaves, we'd rather remain slaves in Egypt, at least stay alive, than going to the desert and dying. Meaning, the people see traveling to the desert as traveling to your death. In fact, all through the desert, we'll see the people think they're on a death march, and ends up that's almost what happens. And then Moshe tells them, "Don't worry." We'll see. Again, we have to do that story in detail. But let me make my point clear. What I'm trying to say is that if Am Yisrael only got permission to leave Egypt from Pharaoh, you would not have gotten the people to leave overnight. What do we need? Listen carefully. We need Pharaoh and the Egyptian people to kick us out. You with me? And we're going to see, we never even said, let my people go and serve me. He says, send my people out. And what we're going to need, in order to get the Jews out of Egypt overnight, I'm going to need Pharaoh and the Egyptian people to do the dirty work. I'm going to need the Egyptians to kick us out of Egypt. It's called expulsion. The word is girush, and we'll see it. Everything I'm telling you is all in the psukim. It'll take us a couple of weeks to see it. We'll take 2 or 3 classes to prove it and see it inside. But what I want to show you as far as the framework goes, to understand the story of the Exodus, and that'll take us back to the burning bush narrative. If I want to understand God's master plan is to get the Jews to the land of Israel, out of Egypt to the land of Israel. But the main thing he needs someone to get us out of Egypt. And in order to get the Jews out of Egypt, I don't need Pharaoh to give us permission. I need Pharaoh and the Jewish people to kick us out of Egypt. We're going to be expelled from Egypt. How's that going to happen? I need to convince Pharaoh and the Egyptian people that the reason for the plagues, Remember, there's plague after plague after plague, and each plague's getting consistently worse. The reason for all their trouble is because this Jewish people have to serve the God in the desert. I need every Egyptian to be convinced that the only way to stop the plagues is to send the Jews out to go serve the God according to their instructions. And the only alternative to that would be our certain death. Every Egyptian has to say it's in his interest that the Jews go serve the God in the desert. How do we convince them? Let me give you a really bad example from global warming. Let's say someone 20 years ago says, you know what? He says, if we don't start recycling, plastics, whatever it is, whatever you have to do, there'll be a hole in the ozone and there'll be global warming and, the Earth is going to drown everybody. Again, I'm just exaggerating. But let's say someone 20 years ago said, if you don't do A, B, C, D, over the next 20, 30 years, there'll be tidal waves, different weather, all these, volcanoes, there'll be all these terrible things if you don't start recycling and taking care of your environment. And everyone laughs him off. But he says in his prediction, this will happen after 2 years, after 4 years, after 6 years. And then as time goes on, every prediction that he said in his document 20, 30 years ago came true. After there's tidal waves and volcanoes and crazy weather patterns and hurricanes and things like that, if everything he said that would happen in the first 10 years is coming true, people might be convinced maybe he was right, and maybe they'll go and listen to him. Hope you understood my analogy. Meaning, if you tell Pharaoh in the beginning, if we don't serve our God, there'll be all these terrible plagues, all these terrible things are going to happen, no one will believe him. But if before every plague, there's a warning, and we warn Pharaoh and the Egyptian people, if we don't serve our God in the desert, what will happen? There'll be more plagues. And the reason why the plagues are getting consistently worse is because we have to serve our God. The God of the Ivrim needs to be worshipped a 3-day distance in the desert. And if not, it's only going to get worse. They might not believe it in the beginning, but time after time, warning after warning, when every warning comes true and you can't say it's by chance anymore, they'll finally give in. Now, I'll just give you one example. After I share my screen, I'll give you one example from the 7th plague, where it's explicit in the beginning of Parshat Bo, before the 8th plague. In Parshat Bo, God says as follows. Again, everything on the source sheet we'll go back and do properly in the next set of shiurim. But here, in chapter 10, verse 7, this is the beginning of Parshat Bo, so you probably know these psukim by heart. This is before the 8th plague. Paro's servants, doesn't mean that's not his slaves, that's his cabinet. Abdei Paro means, here, Abdei Paro is going to be a big theme in Sefer, in the story of the Exodus. Abdei Paro are his closest advisors. I call them his cabinet members. So Paro's advisors tell him as follows. How long is this nation going to be a stumbling block to the Egyptians? Shalach et anashim, send these men away, send this nation away. Let them go serve their God. Don't you realize Egypt's going to be wiped out? Okay, so they bring Moshe and Aaron back to Pharaoh. Go serve your God, who's going? And then Moshe says everybody, and they say only the men. Okay, and we'll do again all this in detail later on. But what do you see from here? After 7 plagues, even Pharaoh's closest advisors, his cabinet ministers, they're all encouraging him, let them go already. Right? And Pharaoh gives in, okay, go, and then he'll say, but let the men go. Right? And then finally, after 9 plagues, what's Pharaoh say? Pharaoh says, you know what? Go serve your God. Let the women and children go, just leave your cattle behind. And Moshe says, that's not enough. We have to bring our own cattle. It's a logical line, it is in their interest. And I need all the Egyptians. I need all the Egyptians I need everyone in Egypt to be convinced. 1 second. I have a connect. Okay, I'm good with my connection's okay. Where's Melissa? We're good? Okay. What I need to do is I need all the Egyptian people, okay? I need everyone in Egypt to be convinced that it's in Egypt's biggest interest for us to go serve our God in the desert. And that way, when we leave Egypt, what happens? They're eager for us to serve our God. Now, I want to show you two things that will prove this in the 10 minutes we have left. Let me show you as follows. Again, I want to show you what's God's master plan. I need to convince Egypt it's in their interest for us to go serve our God, so that when we leave Egypt, they're more than willing to give us, to lend us whatever we need. Again, of course, everyone's assuming coming back, we have nowhere else for them to go to. So let's take a look. Let's take a look at, we're back to our source sheet here. Let's go back to let's go back to my Chumash. Let's go back to my Chumash, and we'll read something. We're going to go back down to the burning bush and see something that is really strange. Here, share my screen, and first I want to show you here in chapter 3. Listen carefully again to God's message to Moshe Rabbeinu, what to tell Pharaoh. Okay, the people will listen to you. You're going to go to the elders of Egypt and tell them, God appeared to us. We have to go serve God a 3-day distance in the desert. Listen what the continuation. I know Pharaoh is not going to let you go. In other words, I don't want him to say yes. If like Rabbanu is saying that this he could say yes to, but he wouldn't say no to freedom, here's exactly the opposite. God doesn't want Pharaoh to say yes. God wants Pharaoh to say no. And therefore, I'm telling him something that I want him to say no to. Is I know he's going to say no. Listen carefully. Meaning, I'll prove to you this is Pharaoh's yad chazaka. Because I know Pharaoh's not going to let you go. He's not going to send you out. And certainly, he won't kick you out. Pay attention to this word yad chazaka. Is it going to be God's yad chazaka or Pharaoh's yad chazaka? We'll see later it's going to be both. But I need Pharaoh's yad chazaka to kick us out of Egypt. Keep that in mind. He's going to explain later why we eat matzah. Listen. Then what's God say now? He goes, go tell Pharaoh this plan. And God's telling Moshe Rabbeinu, your job is to go to Pharaoh and fail. Just think of that for a minute. God's giving Moshe Rabbeinu a job to do. He says, go to Pharaoh, ask him to send you out to go serve your God. And your job, Moshe Rabbeinu, is to fail. I compare this being a shul rabbi. It was, your job is to give drushes every Shabbos, and I'm telling you ahead of time, no one in shul is going to listen to you. I mean, God's saying, Moshe Rabbeinu, I want you to go to Pharaoh, and your job, part of my master plan is your job is to fail. I don't want Pharaoh to say yes. I want him to say no every time. Because I want you to fail in your mission. I want you to go and ask Pharaoh, give us permission to go serve our God 3 days in the desert. And I want Pharaoh to say no, and I'm doing everything so he will say no. I'm going to harden his heart, we'll see. And now we have to see why, because there's going to be a buildup here, so that when he does send us out, he's going to kick us out. Watch. Okay? Because I know that Pharaoh's going to say no. I don't want him to say, but God says, I know he won't let you go. But go ask him anyhow. Remember, we'll go time and time to warn him beforehand. And certainly he won't kick you out with the Yad Chazakah. And then, V'shalakti et yadi, then I'm going to send my hand. V'ketet mitzrayim, I'm going to send all the plagues. V'choni flotai asher sebekirbo. That's going to be the 10 plagues. We'll see later, Moshe doesn't realize how many plagues there's going to be yet. After I give him all my plagues, then he'll send you out. Listen carefully. This is part of the master plan. When he does send you out, I'm going to make sure the Egyptians are going to find favor in your eyes. And therefore, when you leave Egypt to go serve your God, you won't go empty-handed. And therefore, when you leave Egypt, everyone asks their neighbor, and from their, anyone who they're familiar with, okay, ask them to borrow silver and gold and clothing and nice things like that, because we're going to serve our God. You can't wear shmatas. You're going to go to shul, you have to have nice jewelry. You have to eat on good vessels and things like that. Because if you want to placate your God and make him stop the plagues, you better do a good job. Therefore, everyone in Egypt who's afraid they're going to die from another plague will lend us anything we need. Just be in a good mood and go serve your God as you wish. So therefore, as you leave Egypt, take advantage of that frame of mind and borrow whatever you can. But sometimes just take everything you can and dress your kids with 4 pairs of clothing and everything you can borrow from Egypt. Take advantage of the Egyptians when they're in the mood to lend you whatever you want. And that's how God will get, that's how we'll get our Rechush Gadol, as Ebenezer pointed out. Now, as I'm trying to show you, at the burning bush, this is part of the burning bush narrative, God is telling Moshe Rabbeinu, here's the master plan. And therefore, your job, Moshe Rabbeinu, is to fail until I tell you it's time to get out. I want you to go to Pharaoh, and we're going to gain something by Pharaoh saying no. Your job is to warn them, saying, send my people out, otherwise there'll be a plague. I want Pharaoh to say no, and I'm going to harden his heart, we'll see. So he says no, because I want him to go through plague after plague after plague, and only after I sort of wind up all the tension. Because finally, when he does send you out, right, he's going to kick you out, and we'll see, and then that will enable you to get the great wealth. Now, here's an example of this. Let me just check the chat real fast. Okay, we have to 1 o'clock with that, not to Rav. When Jews left, okay, when we left the Soviet Union, okay, how many left? Again, didn't all leave at once, and okay, we'll deal with modern day analogies later on. I was talking about analogies from America, not so much the Soviet Union, but you're right there. A lot more also. Not everyone came to Israel, not everyone overnight, and a lot of them went to different countries as well. Now let's go back to our topic. Let's go to the end of chapter 5 in Sefer Shemot. In the end of chapter 5, watch what happens. Moshe goes to Pharaoh, remember, and tells him what? The same thing God told him to do. God called upon us to go 3 days in the desert. Again, penif keinu b'dever v'cherev, that gives it away. But when Pharaoh hears the warning, otherwise we're going to get smitten. Remember, dever and cherev are going to come up in the 10 plagues. Dever and cherev are going to be the framework for all 10 plagues. And then what's Pharaoh say? He says, Moshe and Aaron, how come you're bothering people from work? What's then? And you have too much free time, and therefore Pharaoh doubles the workload. Everyone knows the story. Again, we'll read it later in detail. When the story's over, everyone's really angry with Moshe. Moshe tells the people, he promises them freedom, and everything gets worse. Moshe comes as a redeemer, saying God's come to redeem your people. Everyone's all excited, as we'll see. And then they finally go to Pharaoh, and everything backfires and gets worse. What happens? Pasuk Yotet. Vayirush shotrei bnei Yisrael otam bara lemor. When Moshe and Aaron come out of Pharaoh's palace, I'm sorry, but what's Pharaoh? Let's go back a little bit. When Pharaoh says, you guys are too lazy, nirpim atem nirpim, therefore you're saying we want to go serve our God. And now instead of, listen, vatan lechu ivdu, got it? Not go serve your God, go serve Egypt. Remember? Go now serve God. I'm not going to give you straw, and you have to pick, they're going to double the workload, and they have to collect their own straw instead of getting straw from Egypt to make the bricks. And therefore, the officers, when Moshe and Aaron are leaving Pharaoh's palace and they have to enforce these new laws, this double workload, they're really angry with Moshe and Aaron. And he says, and he tells them, don't make any less bricks, even though you have to collect your own straw. And they bump into Moshe and Aaron, okay, meeting them when they leave Pharaoh. The officers of Israel, the people in charge of the slaves, the taskmasters, the Jewish ones, saying, Hashem should judge you. Look at this fine mess you put us into. Things were bad enough. Your visions of this messianic vision only made things worse. God should see and judge you. Okay? Asher hivashtem et rechenu, you made us look bad b'nei Pharaoh b'nei avadav, letet cher b'yadam lahargenu. Your messianic hopes of freedom and everything you're talking about only made life worse for us, and you're giving Egyptians another cause to kill us. What's Moshe can say? Moshe has nothing to say to them. They're right. Moshe turns to God and says, Hashem, or Adon, Lama hareota lama zeh, how come you made things worse? But lama lo zeh shlachtanu. Why'd you make things worse for us? Why'd you send us out? From the time I went to Pharaoh, I did my job. I went to him, and things only got worse. You didn't keep your promise. It's clear how, as we'll see, Moshe doesn't understand God's master plan. God tells Moshe Rabbeinu, do this. Remember, God tells Moshe Rabbeinu, I'll take care of it. I'll be with you. You just do what I tell you to do. Again, your job is to fail, basically. Your job is to go to Pharaoh, and I'll take care of the rest. And Moshe tells God now, you're only making things worse. What do you want from me? And everyone's angry with Moshe Rabbeinu. I don't know why they ended the chapter here. The chapter division should really be the next pasuk. Chapter 6, which verse 1 should be the end of chapter 5, as a Parshas Sos. But Moshe, listen carefully. What's God tell Moshe Rabbeinu? Ata tireh asher aseh leFaro. God tells Moshe, you wait and see. Need a little patience. Why? You don't understand what's going on, Moshe. But I want you to realize, ki biyad chazakah. Listen, who's a no say here? Pharaoh is the topic. Okay. God tells Moshe, you'll see what I'm doing to Pharaoh. Let me make this a little bit bigger, real fast. Here. God tells Moshe, now see what I'm going to do to Pharaoh. Ki biyad chazakah yishalchem. What'll happen? Pharaoh is going to send you out with his yad chazakah. Uviyad chazakah yigarshem me'artzo. I said the topic here is most partially point out. Pharaoh's yad chazakah is going to send you out, and more than that, he's going to kick you out of his land. See the word girush? That's going to be to expel. I need Pharaoh to expel us from Egypt. And that goes back to my point. In order to get the Jews out of Egypt, I need Egypt to do the dirty work. I need Egypt to expel all the Jews out of Egypt to get us out of there. Now, I'll bring one last proof in the story of the Exodus of this whole point. Let's go now to chapter 12. When we actually leave Egypt, what happens? Moshe tells Pharaoh, what do you call it? Pharaoh finally gives in after the 10th plague. And listen what happens. Remember, he says, go, Pharaoh calls Moshe and Aaron and says, go serve your God, go serve God like you said. Take your cattle with you. We'll talk about the negotiations later on. Listen carefully about the Yad Chazakah. But why do we leave Egypt? See the word chazak here? But the reason we leave Egypt is because we're being thrown out of Egypt by the Egyptians. We're not rushing out because we're in a rush. We just had a whole nice meal at night. In the middle of the night or early in the morning, after the whole plague of the firstborn for midnight, there's this big mess in Egypt. All the Egyptians now, the entire Egyptian people are going to be strong now on the Jews, kicking them out of Egypt. So the Egyptians were urgent upon us, as they say in English. But the word chazak here is what's important. Okay? To quickly send us out of the land, because the Egyptians are saying we're all going to die if the Jews don't serve their God. And we are rushed out by the Egyptians so quickly. Why? That we don't have time to bake our bread. We were planning to bake our bread in normal ovens. We didn't bake our bread, not because we were in a rush, but because the Egyptians were rushing us out. And then because the Egyptians were rushing us out, so eager for us to leave, Bnei Israel did as Moshe told them, and they borrowed from Egypt. And God, like he said he would, and God's plan, as we saw in the burning bush, for this master plan, we gain not only two things. The Egyptians are eager to lend us whatever we need, and the Jews are out of Egypt because the Egyptians kicked us out of Egypt. And therefore, when we leave Egypt, what happened? Listen carefully. We leave Egypt, in the big rush. What do we do the next morning if we didn't have time to bake bread in our ovens? Because the Egyptians, we took the dough with us. We took the dough and ran. We baked the dough we took with us. We quote this verse in our Haggadah, explaining why we eat matzah. Why do we eat matzah? Listen carefully. Okay. Eating matzah, we remember not only that we left Egypt, but that we were thrown out of Egypt. To leave Egypt, we needed Egyptians to throw us out. We were expelled from Egypt. We couldn't linger in Egypt. Why? Because Egypt wouldn't let us stay, and we had nothing else ready. That's the end of the story of the Exodus, in the play-by-play version of it. Meaning, bottom line, when we leave Egypt because we're thrown out of Egypt. We're thrown out of Egypt, not for good, we're thrown out of Egypt, they're forcing us to go serve our God in the desert. That they won't let us stay in Egypt. Everyone has to go and serve our God in Egypt, and that's the only way the Egyptians can save their lives, by us stopping the plagues. And therefore, they lend us whatever we want. So if I want to go back to my original question, what was God up to? What's the reason? If I want to go back to the original question, why the lie? Why the cover-up? Why the contradiction? I'm trying to explain there's a lot of logic in lying, but not because a lie, not because Pharaoh wouldn't say yes to freedom. I need the lie so that Egypt, Pharaoh, not just Pharaoh and his servants and his advisors and all the Egyptian people have to be convinced that it's in Egypt's interest for us to leave Egypt and go serve our God, with the assumption we're coming back, because where else are we going to go to? And by telling the Egyptians that we're going to, that if the reason for the plagues is we have to serve our God in the desert, plague after plague builds up the tension. And finally, after 10 plagues, everyone's convinced, especially so many people die in the plague of the firstborn. Everyone in Egypt is super eager to just go and serve your God. And what do we gain by it? We get all the Jews out of Egypt overnight. We'll see later our Korban Pesach is going to make sure everyone's ready to go and everyone's accounted for. We got with great wealth, as God promised in Brit Ben Abtarim, to Avraham Avinu. And that's how the Exodus begins. Now, then we have to see, why does Pharaoh change his mind? That'll be a standalone shir, which would be amazing. In other words, Pharaoh, as we'll see later on, is going to change. Well, we'll do it properly in the shir. What's going to cause Pharaoh to change his mind and chase us anyhow? And when did he decide to chase us? Because we don't come back, or because we do come back? That we'll have to study. Now, in light of that, let's go back to the very beginning of the story of the Exodus and show you that's exactly how the story begins. What begins the enslavement? What is Egypt's biggest fear from day one? Remember, there's a new king over Egypt. Okay, Vayomer Elamo. What's he say? There's a new dynasty. Remember, the Jews were very powerful in the previous dynasty. A new dynasty comes in, and everyone's blaming the Jews for, the previous dynasty. He says, this migrant people now are being stronger than us, and they're going to take over our country. Let's outsmart them. Penyir, what's their fear? They might increase even more number in Egypt. Should war break out and a foreign power try and take us over, what will happen? And if a foreign power, like has happened before, will come and try to take over Egypt, what will happen? That's what we call like the fifth column. We're afraid if the Jews in Egypt are going to join a foreign power and kick us out of our own country. Okay? They're going to join the foreign power coming to take over our country, and they'll fight from us from the inside. As Rashi points out, what's going to happen? Either the Jewish people are going to come from the inside and the foreign power from the outside, and we'll be in a pinch, or they're going to cause us to leave the land. But we're not worried that there'll be a rebellion and we'll leave, because remember, we're not slaves yet. What's Egypt worried about us leaving if we're not slaves yet? With nothing stopping us. But rather, they're worried about a takeover from a foreign power and the Jews joining up with the foreign power to do a takeover. And therefore, to stop the Jews from taking over the country or being part of a takeover, they make them fourth-class citizens, enslave them, and they put them to hard labor. Okay, and then even though they afflicted them, remember, we became more and more, we multiplied, etc. Remember, I told you we have to do the burning bush before we read chapters 1 and 2. We have to do the burning bush first, because this background is going to explain basically. I want to use this background to explain the whole story of the Exodus from chapter 1 to chapter 14. So again, let me just summarize my key point. Again, we began with Rabbau's big question of the obvious contradiction between God's plan to Moshe go to Pharaoh and what's Moshe supposed to tell the people of Israel. And he says that was the plan, so that we needed Pharaoh to let us leave to serve our God, but he wouldn't give us freedom. I was flipping it around and saying his analysis is right on the mark, but my point is it's exactly the opposite. Telling the truth wouldn't work, because the Jewish people wouldn't believe it and Pharaoh wouldn't believe it. I need Pharaoh to kick us out of Egypt, and I need the Egyptian people to give us the great wealth, to lend us whatever when we leave. And what sets up that whole scenario that enables Egypt to kick us out with great wealth is the story that we have to serve our God this 3-day distance in the desert. because God wants to bring plague by plague, build up the tension. So when we finally do leave, Egypt kicks us out and lends us whatever we need. And this is God's plan for how it's to work. Why it's going to be, why Moshe is in the dark, as we'll see. Because no one knows God's plan to the very end, including Moshe Rabbeinu and the people. Okay, let me just take a quick look if there's any questions in the chat, because now my time is up. Okay, that's the link to the sources. Okay, very good. And the connections are fine already. Anyway, that was my little introduction to the story. We have to do now is see, I'm going to use this background to explain almost all the questions in the Exodus story. It'll be a little different than the movies. Maybe we'll make a new movie one day of this version. And I'm more than willing to take, criticism on